Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today we have a special treat. We are going to be talking to co-founders of Third State Books, and often we interview authors and illustrators, but we're going to get more of a behind the scenes look at the industry, the publishing industry, and we're going to be talking to Stephanie Lim and Charles Kim, who are the co-founders of Third State Books. I'll get them on here. Asian American publishing company. So it's going to be really fascinating talking to them about what that process is like and why it is so important. Hold on just a minute. We'll get them on here for you. And remember, you can join us every Thursday, usually at this time, the 2 p.m. Eastern. Hello. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yes. Of course. Thanks for having us.
Charles, I know he was on here too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me send him the invitation again. But maybe while we're waiting for him, you could go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about how you got involved in publishing.
Sure. Hi, I'm Stephanie, one of the co-founders at Third State Books. I'm coming at this not from a deep involvement in publishing. I had actually been an intern 20 years ago when I was in college at Penguin Putnam in the at Dutton Children's Books, actually. And I also did a year-long internship with Charles Bridge Publishing, which is a well-regarded educational publisher in Watertown. And I think my story of why I didn't go into publishing kind of speaks to why Third State Books is so necessary now. And it's really comes down to, like, it was really hard for me to be able to tell my immigrant parents who came here with just a couple $100 in their pockets back in the 70s that I was going to take my college degree, go to New York City where I have like no family, no network whatsoever, and make $26,000 a year, as an editorial assistant, which, granted, many people have done that and made the sacrifice. It was harder for me, I think, especially because I'm from Southern California and had no so instead I moved back home and entered entered Hollywood as an assistant, making $26,000 a year, but at least I could go home and do laundry on the weekends and tutor to make ends meet. But I think that really speaks to the lack of diversity in the publishing industry, because really the people who can afford to do that are often trust fund kids or people who have a lot of support, who it's like kind of a legacy industry for a certain set of people from New York City.
And Charles, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us, we were just talking about how you got involved in publishing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Kim. I'm co-founder with Stephanie Lim of Third State Books. Let's see, how did I get involved in publishing? I fell into it by accident 30 years ago. I was in graduate school for French literature and absolutely miserable. And I had a part-time job as a contract and royalties manager for an agency called the French Publishers Agency, which was subsidized by the French Ministry of Culture, and it represented 25 of France's best publishers for translation rights into English. And I worked there part-time while in graduate school, and then they offered me a full-time job as an agent, which allowed me to come in. I arrived in this country at the age of 7 with my mom and 2 brothers, and we grew up extremely working class, and don't come from a family that could have supported me while I made $26,000 a year. And so I lucked out and entered at the full agent level and was able to earn a salary that allowed me to continue living in New York. Yes. So, and that was the only way that I would have been able to enter into publishing. And it never even occurred to me that I would work in publishing despite being, in graduate school for literature, just because I didn't know anyone who worked in publishing. There was nobody in my family, no one in my friends network, absolutely no one whom I knew, who had made a decent living for themselves as as a publisher or editor or working in the industry. And, my mom, the good immigrant mom she said, be a doctor or a lawyer. And so no one ever said to me, you can actually work in books and make books and contribute to culture in that way and still earn a living by doing that. And I think that lack of connection, that lack of network really stymies a lot of Black and brown folks from going into the industry.
It's interesting, which goes back to, why it is so important to have a publishing company like Third State Books. Could you talk a little bit more about what the inspiration was behind starting it and why the name Third State Books?
Charles can take this one.
Yes.
Because I can never remember
the name of the name Third State comes most directly from a French-Moroccan writer named Tahar Benjeloun, and he spoke of a third place in French, a troisième lieu, and it was a space. It was not just a physical space, but more important, an emotional, intellectual, spiritual, barren place in between. One's homeland, where one no longer feels like a native, and in one's country, adopted country, where they never feel like a native there as well. And so it was a place of isolation for Benjeloun, and other writers like Edward Said and Homi Bhabha and others have also spoken about this place. And for us, what we've seen is that what we saw growing up as liabilities, our heritage, our skin color, our language, that these things were looked at as liabilities. We had to be more American than the Americans. And by Americans, I mean white Americans. And more, our cultures, our heritages, our backgrounds have become assets rather than deficits and liabilities. And so Stephanie and I talk all the time about how publishing still seems to be stuck a lot of times in propagating deficit narratives about communities of color and communities that have historically had low engagement with publishing. And what we would like to do at Third State is provide a platform where Asian American writers of all kinds of backgrounds can tell genuine, authentic stories and feel supported editorially, design-wise, production-wise, marketing-wise, publicity-wise, to be able to tell their authentic truth and to find their audience. And for us to also equally prioritize Asian American and other readers who are looking for these authentic stories without anyone having to dumb down or water down or whitewash any of our narratives, which happens quite a bit in traditional media and in publishing. And so that's where we got the name Third State. Stephanie, do you want to tell them about she has this excellent phrase, which is founder dating. Can you tell them?
Oh, well, basically we had been put in touch by a an acquaintance of mine who had been one of Charles's literary clients, because she remembered that I had this background in publishing many, many years ago. I then since went into actually digital marketing and e-commerce. So I'm coming at this over the course of 2022. Charles and I met on a regular basis, just kind of sussing out our vision, our mission, and then him kind of telling me a lot about the industry and me going like, what? Like, it works how? Like, why is it done this way? It's all very backwards. It's all very preoccupied with just the way things have been done. And me coming from Silicon Valley, where everybody talks about, let's disrupt this industry and, So, I mean, it's kind of a meme, but that's kind of the mindset that I'm bringing to this, is why, just questioning things at every level, being why, some of it works, right? Some of it obviously works and works well. And then some of it just makes no sense whatsoever. So, we're really looking to take the best of both worlds, and find a better path forward for everybody. I mean, it's not just about the Asian Americanness, but it's also looking at just how business is done.
Could you give us some examples about that, or just in general talk about you have a panel discussion coming up called Owning the Narrative. So what difference does it make to have Asian Americans in control of all aspects of a book's publication? Like when an author comes to you or illustrator, what difference does it make to them to be working with you versus a different publisher?
I mean, I think it really, we talk about this a lot, where actually as a total, Asian Americans are doing okay in terms of representation. When you look at total numbers, we're about 7% and growing of the population, and we published about 7% of the books in the last few years. But if you look at how these authors are being plugged into this very homogenous system where they're being represented by a white agent, they're reporting to a white editor, the entire marketing and publicity team is usually like white, and then the executives who are pulling the purse strings, the people who are really making the decisions around like, these are our marquee authors for this season, and then to hell with everyone else can sink or swim for all we care. And the people making those decisions are usually not of the same background. And even it comes down to things like, one example from one of our upcoming rom-coms is the Pride and Preston Lynn, which is a Pride and Prejudice remake. There are certain lines that, for instance, one of the lines that came up, which honestly a white editor would not even blink twice, but we were like, this absolutely has to change, was like, it takes place in the competitive swim world, and the main character is like, isn't it tough to coach a bunch of Asian kids because their parents all are so intense, right? And we were like, absolutely not. Have you met crazy white sports parents? We can't, like, as Third State Books, forward this narrative of like the crazy tiger parent, right? Because it's not exclusive to Asian Americans, and it's so we changed it to something like coaching a bunch of Silicon Valley kids, where all the parents want their kids to go to Stanford, and that's like patently true. Regardless of their background,
books are a foundation of any culture, any civilization, and yet when it comes to how books are made, which authors and writers get published, how much they're paid, how their books are marketed and publicized, what is spent to market and publicize them, how they're sold and distributed, etc. The industry itself is very, very opaque, and that's intentional in many ways, because those in power want to remain in power, and they want to keep the status quo. And as I said to Stephanie when we first met, you can't innovate in publishing by asking people in publishing. And I think our partnership has worked so well because, if I had worked with someone else in publishing, they might have just assumed that sales and distribution and marketing are going to happen a certain way because that's how it's always been done. And to have a partner that has been willing to push that idea and push these these concepts a bit further and say, well, why does it have to be done this way? Can we think of other ways to do this? And we do think that we are, as Stephanie said, there are some things that work extremely well. And so we're doing that. We are making sure that our books are getting reviewed as widely as possible, because book reviewers are incredibly important for librarians and booksellers and readers and publishers and editors who are trying to find out about, what the good books are. But at the same time, we feel that, when traditional industry insiders, when they close their eyes and they picture their ideal reader, they are not looking at what America really looks like.
They're not considering like a Filipina in Houston, Texas. They're looking at Charles loves to use the example of a white woman in Kenosha, Wisconsin, reading Crazy Rich Asians with her book.
And so
club.
black and brown,
that's really what
and black and brown writers are forced to adjust their narratives and their stories to appeal to this imagined ideal reader that the publishing industry has. In the meantime, more than 50% of all Americans 18 and under are black and brown. So we need the industry to catch up with the reality of America and to honor and provide space and support for the wealth of diversity and for all the communities that have just not had a chance to engage with the publishing industry and speak from their hearts and find the audiences that want to hear those stories.
And I know you've had in one of your social media posts that you talk about how great it is to have on the editorial team and general with the book it's that you're publishing to all have like a shared cultural framework and shared experiences, so you don't have to explain certain things, or you have similar sensitivities to, like the example you were talking about with the stereotype, So what is that like? How does that make it different when you're working with authors and illustrators and you have that shared cultural framework?
I mean, I think this particular post was referring specifically to an editorial meeting we had on our upcoming book, What in the World is Ezra's Art, which is not really about identity or culture at all. It's really about a little boy who loves to create art, and he just happens to be, he's actually Hapa. And I'm sorry, we can't use the word Hapa anymore, apparently. He's mixed race background. And he, we just had an entire discussion about the assumptions that we're making, us struggling with this tiger parent narrative where we are trying to do the gentle parent thing, but there's pieces of us, all of us, that are we really do, we have internalized this drive towards excellence in that a lot of our parents instilled in us, and so we struggle with that internally. And then this is a book about really honoring the urge to create, despite the little boy is not very good at art. I mean, from a traditional kind of a representational perspective, and he's kind of discouraged in many ways by the people around him, and it's about him finding and being true to that internal urge to.
But he's not racialized the way that many traditional children's books still. The Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison does these demographic surveys of children's books. I mean, an incredible resource for all lovers of children's books. And they talk about how still a majority of children's books that feature an African-American or Asian-American character racialize or otherize our communities. And so in a lot of Asian-American children's books published by the Big Five, for example, we still see stories of, kids being bullied because their lunches smell bad, or that they have tiger parents, or they're only good at math and science, or they're always playing some sort of sidekick, but they never get to be, the pirate, the adventurer, the state championship winning quarterback, the romantic lead, etc. And we think it's really important to make books and share books that in which our kids and all kids can see Asian American characters that reflect back to them what the diversity and the complexity of their identity, and not just in these same old buckets. My daughter, who is going to turn 18 next month, she was never bullied for her lunch. Every kid in her school wanted to eat her lunch because she had cool Korean, Asian, lunches that her mother would send her to school with. So that was not her experience at all. And yet so many children's books are about, some kid going, ew, what's that? And that's just a tired trope and narrative that just keeps getting repeated over and over, because publishers are always looking at sales history. And so they're always looking backward at how to see why a book might be popular,
is a lot,
rather than looking forward and saying, who are the kids that are really going to read this,
I think it's also, there is a degree, I think, part of this discussion we had about Ezra's art was kind of examining our own issues, right? And that's why I called it a group therapy session, because we have been pitched by Asian Americans a lot of these, what we call deficit narratives. And I realized at some point that it's like our generation that's kind of working through our traumas through these children's books, which is kind of unfairly saddling the next generation with this trauma. That's not the world they live in. You know, like Charles said, our kids live in a world where the little white girl is asking her mom to make kimbap because, you know, she saw her Asian friend bring it to school. That's the world our children actually live in. And we want to free them to live their lives and be the heroes of their own story.
I love that. And that's so interesting. I know you had talked about it being kind of a healing process from what the narratives are, and also coming from industries that are white dominated. And like you said, trying to rethink, how can this work? How can we do things differently than it's, and so looking at when did Third State Books start?
Well, we launched Lunar New Year of 2023, so just about a year ago, and then our first books will be launched this.
Can you tell us a little bit about the books and kind of what's next for Third State Books? And then I'm just watching the time, so yes. I want to be respectful of that.
Okay. So the first book that we're publishing on February 6th is called Fighting to Belong, and it's volume 1 of a 3-volume series of middle grade graphic novel style tellings of AAPI history. And so volume 1 starts in the 18th century with the first arrival of the first Asian settlement in the United States. They were Filipino sailors that arrived on Spanish ships, and they jumped ship and formed a community in Louisiana, and they're known as the Manila Men. And the book has 4 middle school characters plus a guide, and they can magically time travel and witness some of these events. And so they go through some of the highlights of Asian American history, such as the Gold Rush and the Transcontinental Railroad, and some of the racist laws that were passed to prevent Asian immigrants from owning land or becoming citizens. And it takes the history to the beginning of the 20th century. And then volume 2, which is published in September of this year, will take us through most of the 20th century. And then volume 3, which will be published in January, Lunar New Year 2025, will take us through the 21st century. And we'll look at some of our greatest achievements and some of our most illustrious, Asian Americans, and look at how we've contributed to history. And so that's a co-published project with the Asian American Foundation, better known as TAF. And it has a 10-page curriculum guide in the back of the book that is done by the Asian American Education Project. And so we've got, national organizations that have been working tirelessly to help our community, collaborating with us on this series of books. So that's the first book for middle grade audiences. And then our second book is called, I can actually show you a copy of the ARC right here. It's called Pride in Preston Lynn. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, and it got chosen as a Junior Library Guild Gold Selection, and it just got a starred review in Kirkus. So we're really excited about the response it's gotten so far. But it's an adult, clean, wholesome romance novel, an adaptation. We keep saying Crazy Rich Asians meets Pride and Prejudice, but ultimately it's about this young woman in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and her run-ins with this tall, handsome, well-to-do golden boy Stanford PhD student, and how she dislikes everything he stands for, and yet their lives keep coming together. And so it has some of the familiar plot lines of Pride and Prejudice, and the author is a Regency romance writer, Christina Hwang Dudley, and an Austen scholar. And yet it takes place today in the Asian American community in the Bay Area. And so Junior Library Guild picked it for YA audiences as well because of the crossover potential for the story. So that's an adult book, but it can still appeal to YA audiences. And then the other book that we mentioned earlier that we're publishing in May, it's called What in the World is Ezra's Art? I used to be the associate publisher at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where I started a line of children's books on art and artists. And this book really reminds me a lot about of the books that I made then, because it really, again, is just about a boy wanting to be creative and wanting to practice art, regardless of what anyone says. And, you know, things like visual literacy, things like creativity, etc., are addressed in the book. And despite the main character and his family being Asian American, ultimately, it's just about a boy and creativity.
I love that. And anybody who's watching, you should know we are going to be featuring some of these authors and illustrators in future IG Lives. So watch for those announcements. And I also want to say thank you for everyone who's leaving comments. I just want to read one because I know you guys are probably not able to see it as you're talking. Said, totally agree, Stephanie. Let our kids be the heroes of their own stories and don't saddle them with our generational trauma. So thank you for the comment. Yeah.
Thank you,
and
Jess.
Thank you both for joining us. Like I said at the beginning, I think for those of us who love children's books and YA, it's interesting to learn about the publishing industry because, like you said, that's something that is very opaque to those of us who aren't involved in it, and also to hear what you're doing to disrupt the industry and help make change for the better. So thank you both for joining us today. Anybody who joined us late, this will be up in a few minutes on our Instagram and later on our YouTube channel, so you can watch the whole thing. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us. Yeah.
Thanks
All right.
for
Bye,
having us.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.